What is needed for success in war? The first answer to this question is soldiers and equipment, because the strength of armies is measured by the number of military personnel and equipment. But is this equation valid in all circumstances? Of course not. When we look at the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war in detail, it is clear that this equation is not consistent. Russia, which claims to have one of the most powerful armies in the world, cannot succeed against Ukraine. It is claimed that the Russian army has over 2 million soldiers, including reservists. In addition, the Russian army is said to have nuclear weapons and advanced equipment. But why is Russia failing despite all this? There are many reasons for the failure of the Russian army. The most important one is the inexperience of the soldiers in the army. Hundreds of thousands of inexperienced soldiers who did not want to fight and had never served on a front were assigned to invade Ukraine. These soldiers are doing more harm than good to the Russian army. The situation of the Ukrainian army is very different. Immediately after the unjust annexation of Crimea by the Russian occupiers, the Ukrainian army began rigorous training. Thanks to this training, every single soldier in the Ukrainian army has become a professional fighter. During the invasion of Ukraine launched by Putin last year, this situation was clearly revealed. It has become clear that success in war requires trained and experienced soldiers rather than large numbers. The operation carried out by Ukrainian troops the other day demonstrated this. The 36th Separate Marine Brigade of the Ukrainian army blew up the invading tank platoon in the Donetsk region with a spectacular tactic and ambush. As Anchor Taylor News team, we continue to report the details of this operation carried out by the Ukrainian army and all the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war. With our understanding of accurate and impartial journalism, you can click on the Super Thanks button to support our teammates and our work. Let's examine the details of the attack carried out by the Ukrainian 36th Separate Marine Brigade. The Ukrainian army recently carried out a successful operation in the Donetsk region. The tactics prepared before the operation were spectacular. The Ukrainian army cleared a road through an empty field for the Russian invaders to advance. This road was wide enough for a tank or a military vehicle to move in one direction. This was because the Russian army would not be able to retreat once the attack was launched. Russian troops used the road through the wasteland to attack Ukrainian troops, but Ukrainian soldiers were waiting in ambush. Ukrainian soldiers were waiting for Russian military vehicles to pass on the road they had dug. They were armed with Javelin missile systems. These missile systems had been added to the inventory of the Ukrainian army with the help of Western countries such as the UK and the USA. With the Javelin missile systems, the Ukrainian army had made great gains in many regions. Javelin missile systems are both ground-based and lightweight missile systems that can be carried and used on the shoulder. The armor of the missiles launched by this missile system is thin. For this reason, when it reaches the target, it explodes with more violence than expected. Javelin missiles are very effective in destroying tanks and armored vehicles. Ukrainian soldiers waiting in ambush with Javelin missiles prepared to fire when Russian invaders appeared in the area. But seeing that more than one tank would pass through the roads they dug, the soldiers decided to wait because sometimes waiting for an attack means being able to hit many more targets at the same time. Experienced Ukrainian soldiers knew this important information. One tank on the road soon became 5. The time was ripe for an attack. Ukrainian soldiers fired the first missile from a hill out of sight of the Russian invaders. The first missile successfully hit its target. The invading soldiers driving the Russian tanks were surprised. The tanks advancing one after the other thought of turning back, but they failed because the Ukrainian army had dug the road into one lane. Then the second missile was fired and the second Russian tank was blown up. The Ukrainian army was recording all the images of the attack with drone cameras. The third missile hit the target with a direct hit. In the photos of the attack shared on social media, it is seen that 3 occupying soldiers come out of tank hit by a Javelin missile. One of the invaders coming out of the flaming tank has difficulty walking. The other two soldiers are trying to escape from the area, but they do not realize that their every move is being watched by Ukrainian drones. In this operation, Ukraine's 36th Marine Separate Brigade blows up 5 Russian tanks one by one. The footage of the attack was watched by millions of people on social media. The 36th Marine Separate Brigade released the following statement about the footage. Have the Javelin fighters of the 36th Separate Brigade of Marines named after Rear Admiral Mikhail Obolensky burned Russian armored vehicles in Donetsk region is a real art. There were 2 important elements that enabled the Ukrainian army to succeed in this offensive. The first is undoubtedly the professional soldiers. The footage shows soldiers firing Javelin missiles with ease and successfully hitting their targets with a single shot. The second important development that contributed to the success of this attack was the aid provided by Western countries to the Ukrainian army. In the coming days, many powerful military equipment and vehicles will be added to the Ukrainian army's inventory. Military aid from Western and European countries is of great importance in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Almost the entire world is providing military assistance to the Ukrainian army to stop the advance of the Russian invaders. Germany is one of them. In recent months, Germany announced that it would deliver 18 Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukrainian army. These tanks arrived in Ukraine this week. Poland, Norway, and Canada have also delivered the promised Leopard tanks. The Indian Army, Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov spoke about type kit. Reznikov said he hoped that Western countries would send at least 2 battalions of Leopard tanks by the end of April. In addition, he said that Ukrainian soldiers trained for the tanks sent by the US and France have completed their training. Ukrainian army continues to strengthen. It is said that the Ukrainian army, which is getting stronger day by day, is preparing for a major attack. Oleg Zadornov, a Ukrainian military analyst, made statements on this issue. According to Zadornov, the Ukrainian army will cross the corridor between Russia and Crimea and reach Melitopol and the Sea of Azov from Zaporizhia. Oleg Zadornov explained Ukraine's goal in this offensive as follows: it will split the Russian troops in 2 and cut the supply lines to the troops for the rest in the direction of Crimea. Ukraine continues to deal heavy blows to the Russian invaders with successful operations. The tide of the war seems to be turning against Putin. When do you think the Ukrainian army will launch its big offensive? What do you think about the tactics and ambushes of the Ukraine's 36th Marine Separate Brigade before the attack? Is the aid provided by Western countries to the Ukrainian army effective in the course of the war? The most crucial clashes of the ongoing Ukrainian war are undoubtedly taking place in Bakhmut and Mariupol. Both cities have been razed to the ground by the bombardment of the Russian army. The southern offensive of the Ukrainian army gained great importance towards the recapture of Crimea. The southern offensive, which started last spring, reached its first stage with the Ukrainian army recapturing the city of Kherson in the first place. During the remainder of the time, the Ukrainian army advanced in the Zaporizhia region, as well as Kherson. Especially the advances in Zaporizhia brought Ukraine closer to another route to Crimea. Mariupol, the city of Mariupol, was considered an important strategic city and target for the Russian forces. The city is the largest city in the Donetsk Oblast and was also one of the largest Russian-speaking cities in Ukraine. Mariupol was an important industrial center, home to the Illik and Azovstal iron and steel works, and the largest city in the Sea of Azov. Control of its port on the western coast of the Sea of Azov is vital to the Ukrainian economy. The city allows the passage of Russian maritime traffic, as well as a land route for Russia to the Crimea. Capturing the city was important to give Russia full control over the Sea of Azov. As a matter of fact, in the conflicts that have been going on for a year, the city is vulnerable to heavy attacks by Ukraine, even though it is under Russian control. The Ukrainian army is struggling to regain control of Mariupol. The positive results of these efforts allow the Ukrainian army to increase its superiority over the Russians. So what else would it take to regain control of Mariupol? The superiority of the Ukrainian army in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions in recent months is well known. The Ukrainian army is aware that the road to Mariupol passes through Zaporizhia and continues its attacks against this region. Undoubtedly, the most important place of the Zaporizhia region is Mariupol. The Ukrainian army has focused its efforts on the city to expel the Russian presence in Mariupol. In the evening yesterday, two powerful explosions shook the military bases of the Russian army in Melitopol. Two powerful explosions were heard in the northern areas of the city. There is information that two objects on which Russian troops were deployed were destroyed. According to preliminary information, at least 300 Russian soldiers were killed. The Ukrainian General Staff has not yet released the exact figures, but the exact number of Russian soldiers who died recently and Russian army casualties will be given. On the same day, at least two more explosions occurred in Melitopol, according to local witnesses. Two explosions were heard simultaneously in several neighborhoods in the north and west of the city. In addition, an explosion occurred at an airport in the city of Melitopol. Earlier this week, the Russian military base located at the Melitopol airport has been shaken by explosions dozens of times throughout the year. As can be seen in these systematic attacks on Melitopol, the Russian army is vulnerable to any Ukrainian attack, and it is likely that the Russian army will withdraw from the city in case of an attack against the city. The successive attacks that have taken place in Melitopol for a long time are disrupting the Russian supply and shipping line between Mariupol and Crimea. The primary purpose of these attacks is to cut off the connection of the Russian army in Ukraine with the Crimea following attacks that developed over the week. The Kremlin administration ordered that Melitopol be designated as the administrative center of the Russian-controlled part of the Zaporizhia region. We speculate that this order was clearly given by the Kremlin administration in retaliation for the Ukrainian attacks. This gives us the impression that the clashes that will take place in Melitopol will be even more intense in the future and will be equivalent to the Battle of Bakhmut. So how can Ukraine reach Mariupol via Melitopol compared to Mariupol? The Russian presence in Melitopol is now less, and the Russian defense here looks rather weak. Although the ground getting heavier with the winter months and not allowing any ground operations has increased the air attacks of the Ukrainian army against this city. We can see the first wave of the Ukrainian attacks, which will start with the arrival of spring towards Mariupol. Although the attacks against both Melitopol and Mariupol by the Ukrainian army are currently continuing at full speed, no clear result has been achieved. For this, it is necessary to cut the logistics of these cities as a difficult step. So what is Ukraine doing to prevent Russian logistics in this region? The Ukrainian attack on the logistics facilities of the Russian army in Mariupol made a lot of noise because, for example, after this attack, there were speculations in the information space that Ukraine received the Goldsby long-range missile systems with a firing range of up to 150 kilometers. Moreover, some official speakers began to have implied that the armed forces now have more opportunities to attack Russian troops in Mariupol. But the questions in the minds of the Russian military may have been answered by the Ukrainian defense forces with samples of weapons already available. For example, Gor's guided missiles with a firing range of up to 84 kilometers fired from M270 or M142 HIMARS contain the most correct answer to these questions. If you measure on the map, then actually from the front line to the Russian objects in Mariupol, it is only a little more than 50 miles. And this alone would allow the GMORs to be fired along the ridges in this area at a range of up to 84 kilometers. However, this must be a very risky operation because the Ukrainian artillery here will have to be positioned closer to the front line than usual. In turn, it should be taken into account even at the planning stage when the success of this or that operation with a missile attack on the rear of the Russian army actually depends not only on a particular type of weapon, but also on a number of factors. For example, the availability of suitable routes for rapid entry and exit to the location, the density of air defense systems that do not allow the Russians to capture Ukrainian systems, missiles, and insufficient and constantly missing Russian air defense are some of these factors. So what does Russia think about the Mariupol attacks in particular? Russia is concerned about unexplained explosions in Mariupol, which Russia previously considered possibly beyond Ukraine's routine offensive capability. Russian officials said they reported at least 14 explosions around the Russian military-controlled city of Mariupol in the past week alone. The location of the incidents include an ammunition depot at the airport, 2 fuel depots, and a steel mill that Russia uses as a military base. Referring to the fact that Mariupol is located at least 80 kilometers from the front line, Russian officials stated that they will take some steps to prevent Ukraine's long-range attacks. Although largely devastated before in the war, Mariupol is important to Russia because it is the largest city Russia captured and still controls in 2022 and sits on an important logistics route. But most of Mariupol is in ruins and tens of thousands of people died in the city, from which more than half of the pre-war population of about 450,000 fled. Thousands of bodies were buried in a large area northwest of Mariupol, according to Ukrainian officials and eyewitnesses. Mariupol was a strategically important target for Russia. It has been heavily bombed from the air and land since the beginning of the war, when it came under Russian control in May. Much of the city was destroyed and thousands of civilians died. Recent satellite images show that the 3 major mass graves at Stary, Krim, Manhush, and Vinohradny near Mariupol have been gradually expanding since the spring months, examining incoming satellite images. Officials reveal that 1,500 more bodies have been buried in the tomb since their last examination in June. It is estimated that more than 4,600 bodies have been buried here since the beginning of the war. However, it is not known exactly how many graves there are in total. Ukrainian officials say that at least 25,000 people lost their lives during the war in Mariupol, and between 5,000 and 7,000 people whose homes were destroyed were buried under the rubble. So what do you guys think about this issue? There are a lot of updates from the Donetsk region. Here, the Russian command realized that even if they suppress the revolt and force the Marines to conduct another offensive operation, it would just be another catastrophe. They decided to urgently relocate a rifle brigade in this region and separate Wagner forces detachments when Ukrainians conducted an extensive hammer strike and destroyed the main transportation center that connected east and south. Last time I told you that Russian Marines and some irregular formations refused the order to launch another offensive operation on Volodar due to the extensive losses and lack of equipment. I also told you that Russian command took urgent measures to suppress a mutiny and send Rosgvardia in the region. Recent social media footage confirmed that the Russian command decided to replace the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade with the 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade. It looks like they understood that the demoralized soldiers that watched half of their brigade die over the course of 3 weeks would not be capable of conducting prolonged offensives. Nonetheless, their problems did not end here, because the 136th Motorized Rifle Brigade started demanding Russian military command to provide them with more artillery shells and ammunition before they replaced the Marines. However, even if they receive all the necessary supplies, armor, and ammunition, this one-for-one replacement does not represent a Russian reinforcement of the offensive effort. Internal dynamics within the Russian military is likely driving the potential resumption of the coastal offensives in the short term. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu reportedly ordered Eastern Military District Commander Muradov to take Bahadir at any cost to settle widespread criticism about the lack of progress and significant losses in the Volodar area. It looks like Muradov managed to convince Shoigu during the recent meeting that they need significantly more manpower and equipment reserves to follow through on Shoigu's reported instructions, and that a mere substitution of one brigade with another does not represent a notable fraction of the reinforcements required. because locals continued reporting about the increased movement of Russian forces in the Mariupol area. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces would need to advance upwards of 24 kilometers from the current front lines around Volodar for this offensive to support operations elsewhere in the Donetsk region. In order to achieve it, Russians continued relocating troops to this region. As you might have noticed, Russians are always using columns with civilian buses in order to transfer their manpower from Donetsk to Mariupol. This is because there is no railway connection between these 2 points. There is one railway, but it goes along the front line, which makes it inoperable. In order to constrain the Russian transfer of troops, Ukrainians conducted a hammer strike against a Russian transport hub in Volnovka. Their main target became an auto transport enterprise with a lot of buses. Geolocated imagery confirmed that Ukrainians inflicted severe damage to the building and, according to Russian sources, destroyed at least 10 buses. This is almost half of the potential column that Russians usually use for relocating forces. Today, Ukrainians have also reportedly conducted a hammer strike against a Russian base in Mariupol. Geolocated footage indicated that the target of this strike became the base located in the western part of the city near the airfield. Around a week ago, Ukrainians destroyed here several ammunition depots, so it is highly likely that today's target became forces concentrations, especially given that the Ukrainian Mariupol mayoral advisor recently stated that Russians established a lot of camps where they stationed the newly arrived troops. Overall, Russian attempts to resume costly offensives around Volodar signaled that the Russians continued to dislocate already degraded forces to an operation that they are unlikely to carry out. The Institute for the Study of War pointed out that to make operationally significant gains, Russians would need to achieve a rate of advance that Russian forces have not achieved since the first month of the full-scale invasion. But because of personal motivations of the commanders involved, Russian forces in the area may resume these operations nonetheless. Russian failure here will likely give Ukrainians a strategic advantage because they will be able to start their counter-offensive operation not only in the direction of Melitopol, but also Mariupol.